Thank you, Manisha. And hi, everyone. It feels a little bit strange to be taking this session now. I know that all of you um, are probably feeling the stress that the country is going through, and I'm sure that there are lots of personal challenges as well. So thank you, in spite of all of that. Thank you for making it to today's session. And I think, especially given the context that we are in now, grief and bereavement take on a pretty, important role. And while the original presentation was tailored to just cover aspects of general broad stroke aspects of grief and bereavement, I have tried to incorporate a few things that hopefully you will find more practical in today's context. So I'm just going to get right into it. It is a slightly, long presentation, but I will try and keep it as brief as possible. Please feel free to type in any comments and questions that you might have. I will stop periodically over sections to take questions. I know that as a disclaimer, I know that perhaps some of the things that we discussed today might be a bit triggering for some of you. If that's the case, then we can always leave a little time towards the end for sharing. And I hope for the most part, rather than triggering, it is useful what we talk about today. Some of you have attended other sessions that I have done, so you might find some repetition, but we'll work through this. Okay, so as most of you know, what grief is, on the outset, it's a healthy adaptation to a loss. And so typically when we lose something that we value, then grief is something natural and it is normal. And we have rituals of mourning that are also these healthy adaptations. Now, these rituals of mourning themselves are usually, they have evolved or been prescribed by the social context or the cultural context in which all of us exist. So these rituals of mourning tend to be different in different contexts, but by and large, there is some overlap or some commonalities in the rituals of mourning that we experience or we that we participate in all over the world. So when we say that grief is a natural response to a loss, what are some of the most common kinds of losses that people experience? Now, I'm going to again mention that normally we would have done this session in the context of just serious illness and advanced illnesses and death and dying. But we're also going to take into consideration the current crisis that all of us are facing. So typically in an illness situation, some of the losses experienced, and this is across the board between patients as well as families, is that there's a loss of identity and customary roles that people might have had up until that point. And we've seen this a lot, when someone is diagnosed with a serious illness, they automatically go from being a person to a patient. And it's very few circles in healthcare that actually still identify that person as a person rather than just a case number or a case file. But even within our own families, sometimes, that person's role completely changes, the identity changes. And from what customary roles they might have had of being a mother or being a caregiver, being a provider, those roles also change. And so subsequently, our identity and the way we view ourselves also changes, and that is a loss. We lose physical function in many different kinds of illnesses, and that can be a tremendous loss, especially people who are, extremely independent people. For them to become dependent physically on somebody else is a massive loss, and it's not just a physical loss; it is also a sense of loss of autonomy. So you'll see that I've listed them all out rather than going one by one sequentially. There is an interplay between all these different types of losses that somebody experiences. There is a loss of relationships as well. And it's not just the fact that a person has passed away, but and we've lost, that person, but relationships change. And sometimes relationships end up losing some of the connection that they had. And this is especially true in a social context. Now, in the COVID crisis, we are seeing that we're losing social connections and relationships also. Or on the other side, we also realize what relationships are important to us. So while it is a loss on one hand, it can also be a perspective shifting experience on the other. Material and economic losses, of course, we all know that healthcare is not cheap, and accessing treatment for certain diseases especially can be a tremendous financial hit on the family. And that leads to all kinds of different losses. So loss of a job, loss of savings, reallocation of funds from one aspect. So you might have saved some money in order to do something, but now that money has been taken and put towards treatment costs. So you lose, what you had been saving money for, you lose that thing as well. There's a loss of time, not just in terms of, okay, I thought I was going to live to be 60 years old, but now I'm probably not going to make it through the year. But also in terms of the time spent on caring for that person, or the time spent in, the processes around finding adequate proper treatment, or the time spent on the treatment itself. So earlier, where you would be able to do different activities and spend your time doing different things, that time is now lost to actually the illness or to the disease, or to all the subsequent fallouts from that. Loss of opportunities. Now, we see this in a lot of families where when someone takes on the role of a caregiver, they might have to quit their job, they might have to quit their education, and if they lose their education, then they lose all the opportunities that come with that. The opportunity to, attend a wedding that was important, the opportunity to pursue a dream, all those opportunities are also lost. Plans are lost. Plans and opportunities go hand in hand. I may have many plans for myself, and I'm sure all of you had plans for this year as well. And we thought that 2020 was the monster of a year, and we're seeing that no, now we have this year, which is even more tremendously beastly and ghastly. And so all our plans are lost. Loss of autonomy is a big one, and especially for the patient, because suddenly, especially in our culture, the minute somebody becomes a patient, decisions are made for them. Very rarely are people involved in a shared decision-making equation where they are given the opportunity to express what their choices might be. And often the choices that are made are geared towards cure and geared towards, doing everything we possibly can. And even if that's not what the patient themselves wants for them, these decisions are taken away. The ability to make these decisions is taken away. So that loss of autonomy that comes from that loss of, being able to make decisions for yourself. There's a loss of control. And I see this in a lot of families that I consult with, that one of the most devastating losses is the loss of control, especially amongst people who have been used to making their own decisions, who have a sense of control over finances, who have a sense of control over where they want their lives to go, or how something should happen, or how their household should be run, or even control over the decisions I make for myself. So we lose that control, and with that comes, that might manifest in stubbornness or anger. And I hear a lot of younger caregivers saying to me that, my God, I can't even, I don't understand where this the stubbornness is coming from. And it's because there are very few avenues that people still have control over once they have been diagnosed with a serious illness. We've talked about dignity. Dr. Seema Rao has taken you through some fantastic sessions on dignity, so I won't go into that too much, but there is a loss of dignity that comes with all, especially in the context of all the other previous losses that I have talked about. And the loss of a functioning member. Eventually, when death does occur, we actually lose that person in the family, or we lose that person in our circle. And they carried out some functions. They could be our emotional support. They could have been our providers. They could have been the person in the family that I go to for comfort, or someone who is always on my side. So the loss of that functioning member, and also the loss of perhaps a breadwinner, or someone who carried out a particular practical function within the family. So these are just some of the losses. And if there's something that I have missed, please feel free to share in the chat box as well. And we'll come to that in just a bit. Now, grief is not just an emotional experience. Grief is a total human experience, and it's experienced across all domains that make us human. It is certainly an emotional experience in that It causes a lot of different emotional difficulties, and it is emotionally, it is expressed in different ways. People might, express it through crying. They might express it through emotional numbness sometimes. So it has a massive impact on the way emotional well-being is experienced. It is a cognitive experience as well, in that when we are overcome by grief, it does impact our cognitive functioning. We are not able to think clearly. We might be obsessively returning to memories about that person to the extent where we can't think of anything else. Cognitively, it might hamper our ability to make decisions. There's a sort of confusion that sets in, or there's a sort of cognitive paralysis, in the sense that I find that I'm just not capable of making any logical or rational decisions at this point. Our attention may get affected. I'm unable to concentrate or pay attention to a task. So these are all cognitive functions that get impacted when grief is overwhelming. Grief is a social experience as well, because how we experience grief does impact how we interact with our social setting. And some people become withdrawn. Some people, don't want to meet others. Some people rely on their social circles to get them through the process. And how much social support you have largely determines how your grief is experienced. How isolated you feel or how supported you feel are all determined by your social ecosystem as well. Certainly, it is a spiritual experience. And when I say spiritual, I don't mean religious. Religion is just a part of the whole spiritual experience. Spiritually, there might be a sense of loss of meaning. Nothing makes sense to me anymore. I don't know why this is happening. I question God. I question the fact that I have done everything by the book, and yet I've been a good person, and yet something so horrible has happened to someone I love or to me. And that sort of an experience is on a very existential level. It's not just, it's not just psychological or emotional. It actually makes us question why we are here. What does all of this mean? So it affects all of those things. And finally, of course, it is a physical experience. How is grief a physical experience? If I were to ask you, where in your body do you experience grief physically? What would you say? You can type it in the chat box. Do you feel grief physically? And if you do, where does it usually manifest? For you personally, I mean, people in the heart, head.
It depends, no? Wherever we are weak, it could be bones, muscles, heart.
Yeah, but so not necessarily weak, but yes, it is different for different people. So I'm asking you about a physical experience. Where do you physically feel grief settling? And if you look at the literature, physically, so name a body part where you might experience.
Yeah, then it is heart. Then it's heart.
Okay. Eyes. So, if you read all the literature around grief, you'll hear so much about a tightening of the chest, a constriction of the throat. You've left ring finger, yeah, from your heart. That's a physical manifestation. Fatigue, not much strength to move, absolutely. Some people feel it on their shoulders. You feel a tightening of the muscles. Some people feel almost choked. They feel it in their breath. Some people, like some of you have mentioned, that you feel it in the eyes. So there is a physical manifestation. So next time you are feeling grief, try and also focus on that part of your body and try and release some of the anxiety and some of the tension there, because that is a manifestation of grief. Yeah, stomach. Some people just have digestion issues when they're really sad. Some people have cramps. Some people have backaches. So, and that is true of any strong emotion. You can apply that to anger, you can apply that to sadness, you can apply it to happiness, you can apply it to anything. But grief is such a mix of all these things also. So different parts of your body. So grief is a physical experience as much as it is an emotional, cognitive, social, or spiritual one. There are several factors that influence grief, of course. And I'm not going to go into great detail into this, but I'm just sort of signposting you to some interesting literature that can help you understand this, because grief is a very, very complex emotion, and its impact is felt not only when we lose something, but the way we experience grief or express grief also has a lot to do with attachment styles. Now, Mary Ainsworth's study talks about this. Now, those of you who are trained in psychology are probably aware of attachment theory. And attachment theory talks about how, as children, we form different attachment patterns to our primary caregivers. And usually that is our mother, or whoever is the most dominant adult in our lives, who is in charge of our caregiving needs, etc. And depending on the kind of attachment style, it could be an avoidant style, it could be a conflicted style, it could be securely attached, it could be insecurely attached. That really sort of sets the tone for how we go on to experience grief later in life. So if I have an insecure attachment to my primary caregiver, then I'm always wondering, if this person is going to come back, or if this person, if I have to, win their approval, or what do I do to make them love me? And that sort of a thing also plays out later in life. It can have a huge impact at the end of life as well. And if you have a secure sort of attachment, the coping mechanisms are quite different, and maybe strengthen your capacity to experience and adapt to grief and loss later in life. So attachment theory is, again, quite a vast bit of literature, but it's very interesting. So please go ahead and explore that. Family structure, subgroups, boundaries, and flexibility. So even within our own families, there are subgroups. There is the parent-child unit. There is the parental unit by itself. There's the sibling unit. And how these different subgroups interact with one another determines how those bonds are experienced. Now, there might be a certain alliance happening between certain people in the family against somebody else. And depending on who you're aligned with or who you're conflicted with, that also impacts the way you experience grief in a crisis situation. Boundaries between these subgroups, boundaries between people. Who do I talk to? Who do I go to for comfort? Where do I have very rigid boundaries where, I will not emotionally take some of my worries to this person because there's a very strong boundary there. Whereas with perhaps my mother, the boundary is a little bit more porous and we're able to share more over here. Flexibility, how much family structures are able to be flexible with one another. They make room for each other's emotions. They accommodate each other's emotions. Or there are families where it's very, very rigid structure again, where it's very determined who talks to whom, who makes decisions, who gives permission, how are some behaviors accepted or not accepted, and so on and so forth. So all of those things also go a long way in determining how grief is experienced and expressed. And you will find a lot of this family structure literature in the systems theory. So that is something also that you can possibly look up just for more reading and more understanding of how grief is experienced. Communication patterns within the family. So there is the structure, which is like your genogram. And then there is the communication pattern, which is how do different elements of the structure communicate with one another. And I covered a little bit of that in the previous point, where who talks to whom? How do they talk to each other? What is the emotional experience of talking to that person? So we all know that, some families are more cohesive than others, and there's shared decision making. So when a decision is made about the family, everybody is consulted, or everybody is given adequate information about it. Or sometimes there's a family where only one person makes the decision and everybody else has to fall in line. Now, what happens at a time of grief when that sort of dynamic is in play? And so all of those things also are part of the systems theory, so you can look that up. What if the person who is sick and is has an advanced illness is the person that you relied on for effective communication, or was your buffer who was your buffer when you wanted to communicate to other members in the family? So all of these different dynamics play a big role in how grief is experienced. And when you come outside of the family unit, social support. Cohesive families who are engaged with society versus closed and isolated families. There are some families who have that sort of social cohesion, who have large groups of friends and people that they look to for support, family friends who are like extended family, things like that, or who maintain social relationships with different people in their eco maps. whether it's, it could be a church group, it could be, a support group that you're part of, or it could be, a group of people who come together to do hobbies together, but have another like friendly bond going. So how is the family connected socially around them, and who can they rely on at a time of crisis makes a very big difference. And some families just tend to stick to themselves. They really don't interact with anyone. So when grief is experienced, they're also isolated further in that. So one of the things to remember is that whatever the dynamic in the family, or whatever the coping styles there are in the family, prior to the crisis, prior to the illness diagnosis, prior to the loss, those dynamics get enhanced at a time of crisis. So if a family is cohesive to begin with, they are very interactive, they have shared channels of communication, it is likely that that family will rely on those kind of coping mechanisms to get through a crisis. And the outcomes for them are usually better than a family that has dysfunctional dynamics, because then those dysfunctions become even more pronounced. So all of these things you will find in the systems theory and also in attachment theory. So those are things you can just look up, and I will also try and find you specific papers that we can share with you as learning materials later. So there are different aspects to grief. How grief is experienced is one side to it. How it is expressed is, I might experience grief very, very deeply and strongly, but my culture may prohibit me from expressing it. Or I am expected to express grief in a particular way. So I will do that because that is what is expected of me, right? And then the third is, how do we actually adapt to the loss? So these are three moving parts that happen simultaneously, and they are obviously interrelated to one another, also influenced by the factors that I told you about a little bit earlier in the previous slide. And how is grief really experienced? Again, what we had talked about earlier, that it is experienced on a social level, on a cognitive level, on an emotional level, and socially it is experienced through the behavior with other people, physically through our health and our body functions. And for some people, any volatile emotion, any serious or strong emotion affects their health very, very clearly and in marked ways. Psychologically through thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. So these are the different ways in which grief is experienced. So there's no one way to look at it. Coming down to a more individual level, historically, people talked about, very stereotypical ways that grief is expressed and experienced. And a lot of it was gender-based. And, men don't cry. It's okay for women to express themselves. And I know there were recently, maybe a couple of years ago, ads came out about how it's okay to, for boys to cry and stuff like that. And it's very important to normalize that, because those kind of prescriptive norms by society can be very, very harmful. And when we try to adhere to those norms, so a lot of the traditional ways in which grief was seen to be expressed was in this very polarized sort of black and white way. So people then said, no, a man can also cry, a woman can be stoic and strong and, problem solving. But again, what we were doing is we were talking about male and female. So researchers then changed that whole thing and said, let's not call it male, female, or masculine and feminine ways of expressing grief, but let's talk about it as intuitive and instrumental. Because then we're taking away the gender stereotype. And this is a very, very important thing for us to remember. So if I say that, oh, this guy, it's okay to have feminine ways of expressing yourself, that may not entirely go down well with them. So rather than that, we say intuitive, which is more heart-led, where more energy is invested in affect, which is emotion, and feelings. Such people spontaneously express feelings, and they share their inner experiences. And it's easy for them to talk about their feelings. It's easy for them to share. In fact, we find healing in being able to share and express. Instrumental people are more, they invest more of their energy in cognitive and intellectual pursuits, and they prefer to discuss problems over feelings. So these are the people who, when they're deep in grief, will look for problems to solve, because that's their way of coping with their grief. And it's not better or worse than expressing, but that's their way of expressing. Now you might find that someone doesn't cry, but they start cleaning the house. And but that's their way of expressing their grief, and that's a more instrumental way. Or they might say, okay, fine, now let's figure out, some of the documents are not done, properly. Let's try and figure that out. Or, okay, who's going to look after the child? How do we get, the child in the family some care? So that's where the energies go. Not to say that people are one or the other. There are, like the Venn diagram shows you, that there are intersections also. And there are some people who can switch between heart and head, and they have a blended way of dealing with their grief. They can problem solve, but they also need time to express their emotions and to ventilate and stuff like that. And then there are people who are dissonant, where it's not heart and head, it's heart versus head. And this is where our social norms come in. I might naturally be an intuitive griever, but society dictates that I have to do it instrumentally. And that's where the dissonance comes in. And that's where you'll find that those people get severely affected by their grief, because the way they're expected to express it is very different from how they actually experience it or would prefer to express it. So this is pretty much a more current way of looking at different styles of grieving. And let's also remember that grief and loss do not exist in a vacuum. The loss and the grief experienced by an individual has an impact on the family. How I express and experience my grief will impact my loved ones and people around me. And in turn, how the family experiences it also affects the community. And I think there is no better example than what we are seeing today that is happening in India. So today there's a collective grief that all of us are experiencing. I don't necessarily have to experience a loss due to COVID in my family in order to experience the large scale grief that my community and my country is going through. And in fact, I'm deeply impacted by all the grief that I'm seeing around me, and it is having an impact on me. So this is, we are just, no man is an island. So we are part of a larger family unit, even if that family unit is estranged. So when I say family, it's not just people who live together. I might be estranged from my sibling, but we still are family. And their very absence might complicate my grief as well at a time when I need someone in my family. So there is an interplay whether we live together or not. And this does trickle outwards into the entire community, and there's an inward flow as well. So at the moment, if the grief that is felt in your community, in your building, in your city, it is bound to affect you on an individual level as well. Okay, there is a shifting paradigm, especially what we see in India, where people are moving from extended joint family systems to more nuclear families. People are moving into, from the hinterland areas into metropolitan cities in search of better job opportunities and stuff. Or what we're also seeing a lot now is, members of the family going abroad to settle down. And there's a huge impact on that as well at the moment, because we know of so many people, because of the travel restrictions and all of that, who have to grieve from afar. They cannot come and be part of the grieving process with the rest of their families. And that is complicated by the current pandemic 10 times over. So earlier, the rituals of mourning, there was a role for everybody in the family. And I'm sure all of you in your own cultures have experienced that. This is the role of the older brother, this is the role of the parent, this is the role of the sibling, this is what the grandmother does, this particular puja or this particular ceremony or this particular event is anchored by somebody. So roles or the rituals of mourning were distributed across the extended family, whereas now, because physically we are more isolated, that has been taken away from us. So that has definitely influenced how we experience grief and bereavement, especially in today's context. I'm going to very quickly take you through different facets of grief. So there is grief, and then there is different aspects of it. Anticipatory grief, as the word suggests, is grief that is felt in anticipation of a future harmful occurrence. And this is especially true in prolonged illnesses, prolonged advanced illnesses, when there is a slow and steady decline, in the person's well-being, in their health, in their mobility, in their function, and those kind of cumulative losses, because ultimately that this person is not going to get better. So that that this person is not going to be with you very long, and already the grief settles in, and that is anticipatory grief. There is almost a heightened version of that right now with us, because we don't know We don't know how many of us are going to be impacted in the next week, in the next month, in the next 6 months. And we're wondering, so there's a sort of hypervigilance in the body. And that also translates into anxiety and things like that. So anticipatory grief is grief that is felt in anticipation of a future loss. And it is directly related to the awareness of impending loss. I know that, like when I was younger, there came a point where beyond a certain point, we knew that my mother was not going to make it. And we were all acutely aware that next year, this time, she's not going to be there for Diwali. Or next year, this time, she's not going to be there for this event. So when that event comes along now, we're already grieving her loss or her absence right away. So that is anticipatory grief. And so, yeah, there are different ways that is experienced. And anticipatory grief really requires working through fears. If I allow my anticipatory grief to overpower me, it's going to take away from what can happen in the moment now. And whatever little joy and meaning I can experience now can be crowded over by anticipatory grief. And then that's one more loss that I'm going through, right? So when somebody you encounter is already grieving the loss of the person who is still here, it is very important to work through that, bring them back into the moment so that they don't miss out on what is happening right now and the opportunities they have right now, the conversations they can happen that they can have right now. One of the first fears is fear of the unknown. I don't know what my life is going to be like without my mother. I don't know what my life is going to be like without this person. And to work through that fear, or even for the patient themselves, what's going to happen to me after this? And what's going to happen to my kids? What's going to happen to my wife? What's going to happen to my siblings who are dependent on me? And all of those aggravate the experience of anticipatory grief. The fear of loneliness. And we see this so much. This is, of course, felt by everybody, but you will see this especially so in elderly couples. Because they've spent, especially elderly couples who have a lot of affection for each other, who do everything together. That fear of loneliness is such a heavy thing to carry. And so how do we work through those fears? We try and, of course, never diminish that their loss is going to be a tremendous one, but to reassure them that they're not going to be lonely, that we are there for them. Fear of loss of family and friends, that is something that we're all going through right now. And it is a fear that may not have any resolution. I cannot conclusively make you take those fears away from you, but at least if we talk about it, we break them up into smaller parts, and then perhaps we can work through each of those smaller parts together. Fear of loss of body function. Okay, I have this debilitating disease, and as it progresses, I might not be able to look after myself. I may not be able to bathe myself. I may not be able to, I don't want my husband to have to, change or help me with toileting issues. That is demeaning to me. I remember working with a young woman, and she had an irreversible neurological condition, and she declined very quickly, and they were a young couple. And one of her fears was that she didn't want her husband to have to deal with her menstruating, because she would be fully dependent on him. And she came from that sort of a mindset where that is such an intimate thing, so, and he shouldn't have to do that for me. And but that was a fear she had. And it's a tremendous thing for a young woman to feel that. So this could manifest in many different ways. And fear of loss of identity. Who am I anymore? If I'm not a counselor anymore, if I'm not a teacher anymore, if I'm not able to go out and look after my kids, if I'm not able to earn for my family, who am I? And that's when we work with them through the fear of their loss of identity, that no matter what happens, you will always be someone's father, someone's wife, someone's whatever. So those are very important things to remember, that the dynamic might change, but the role still remains. And this is something that we also say to people who are anticipating loss, that you might physically lose the person, but you don't lose the relationship. So just because the person is no longer around doesn't mean that the nature of your relationship changes, of course, and they're not physically there to respond to you, but that relationship never really goes away. So the other kind of grief that I want to touch upon right now, which is very, very relevant to these times, is complicated grief. And it is intense and long-lasting form of grief. It is pathological grief in some sense, because normally over a period of time, the experience of grief recedes to the back. It may surge during certain times. It may surge triggered by certain memories. It may surge triggered by certain events or whatever. But for most part, it slowly starts to recede into the background, allowing you to continue to function, allowing you to re-engage, allowing you to do your job, allow you to, do your chores, things like that. But in complicated grief, it dominates and overshadows your life. You cannot get past it. And the natural healing process is derailed by certain specific things, like the nature of the relationship with the deceased person. And this is where attachment style comes in. If I completely attached myself to that person and I felt that there's no way I can function without this person in my life, I'm so dependent on them for all my emotional needs and all of my other needs, then when that person goes, then there is a higher chance of complicated grief coming into the picture. It could be a very conflicted relationship also, mind you, which didn't get closure. Abusive relationships, where the abuser is the one who is who's deceased. No chance for closure, no chance to actually bring some sort of resolution to the conflict that we had. Or it could be that I had my brother and I had a fight 10 years ago, and now he's not here, and now he's dying somewhere else, and I can't go be with him. I never got to say sorry. I never got to say thank you. I never got to say all of those things. So then the regret that comes with that is also a big one. Today, in the context of COVID, there is something that is emerging in a big way that complicates grief, is survivor guilt. How come I survived this? And survivor guilt can also happen, especially with NRI families who are in a much more safe environment, whose healthcare systems are looking after them. I have personally heard so many people call and say, I'm feeling so guilty, I can't be there. Or I'm so guilty that, my so-and-so died and I couldn't even do anything about it. And I actually have the resources. I actually have all of this stuff, and it could very easily have been me, but I flew out last year and all of those things. So survivor guilt really also adds to the experience of complicated grief. Circumstances of the death. How did the person die? Was it expected? Was it not? Especially when it was not expected, or if it happened in a way that was not socially acceptable or socially, given as much sympathy or empathy, like, for example, a drug overdose, or in some contexts, suicide. So those kind of events that are considered unnatural or not acceptable in some ways, or comes with some sort of spiritual punitive action or whatever, those are also high risk for complicated grief. Events that occurred after the death, or even circumstances of the death. I mean, stark example is COVID. That the person was fine one day, he seemed to be getting better, then bam, 3 days later has deteriorated and we didn't even have time. Or what we're seeing everywhere, people today dying because of lack of infrastructure. And I'm not going to get into that much because it's a very, 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 very sore topic. And, I know a lot of people are experiencing this. Every single WhatsApp group, every single one of us is part of, there's so many SOSs for beds and oxygen and this and that. And we wonder if those people got those things in time, whether they would still be around. And those kind of circumstances can lead to complicated grief. So we need to be prepared for a tsunami of complicated grief coming. And it's already here amongst us, and it's going to continue to be with us for a long time. Events that occurred after the death. Now, what are some of the events that occurred after the death that can complicate the grief? Property issues, conflict within the family, that one person who was your safety net has died, and now suddenly, you're no longer safe. There are other people who probably have some other agenda, and those kind of things. Children being put into foster homes, There's all of that stuff also that leads to complicated grief. Who steps in to look after a person? It could also very well be that something went wrong during the funeral. We were not able to say goodbye. We were not able to conduct the rituals of mourning that gives that person a sense. We couldn't give him, him or her, the medical support that they needed, but we couldn't even give them a dignified funeral. And that is something that is all around us today. So these are all prime components of high risk for complicated grief. And chronic grief is now complicated grief, chronic grief, also now called prolonged grief disorder. So all of these things mean they're along the same spectrum. So, and finally, I'm going to talk to you about disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is considered unacceptable by others. Now, what could some kinds of grief that be unacceptable by others? Is some examples. The relationship is not recognized by others because they didn't know you had a close relationship. So who are you to grieve for this person? I mean, what are they to you? Relationship was real, but the family or society does not approve it, as in a non-traditional relationship. Same-sex relationships. I mean, that community of LGBTQI is subjected to massive amounts of disenfranchised grief because they're just not recognized as legitimate partners. Or also in cases of disenfranchised grief, similar to complicated grief, is the way the person died is not supported as others, like drug overdose, suicide. But also, if you think about it, a perpetrator of a crime, somebody who has gone out and killed somebody, or I'm going to use the example of so many cases in the US where you have somebody going and doing a shooting, a mass shooting, and that person gets shot, or he dies, or something happens. And what about that person's family? You're so torn between the fact that this person did something so horrible, but at the end of the day, he was your son. But nobody is going to support you when that person died because he's gone and he's done something so terribly horrific outside. So all of these also are, they lead to disenfranchised grief. And it is also experienced when the loss is not a person. And for those of you who are, big animal lovers, you'll know this, that pets, when you lose your one companion who's been your pet, and when they die, they're not given the same, sort of space as if you had lost a person. A failed marriage. People grieve the loss of a failed marriage, even if the marriage was an unhealthy one. Yeah. Unfulfilled dreams. A financial loss or a business loss. Now, suppose I was pulled out of college because they needed the money to pay for my mother's treatment. And that was a college I really, really wanted to go to. It's a loss to me. But when compared to why this took place, in order to do what, I feel like I don't have a right to grieve over this. Because what the loss was in aid of, or what I sacrificed in order for someone else to get something else, I shouldn't be grieving this, because ultimately towards the betterment of someone else. So that is also something that can result in disenfranchised grief. Loss of a loved one's functioning, as in the case of Alzheimer's. So there are many different ways you can look at this, and I'm going to just move on in just being mindful of time. Now, particularly in the context of COVID-19, the fact that the illness itself is, the infection and the virus itself is rapid onset, fast progression, impacts the experience of anticipatory grief. We don't have time to prepare ourselves. It just catches us unaware, and before you know it, within a few days, within a few weeks, or in some cases now we're hearing that people get better, they get out of the hospital, 14, 15 days later, gone. There's obviously increased uncertainty and increased anxiety at this time. And that also complicates our ability to just sit with our emotions and process what is happening. You may not even have the time to sit down by yourself. I mean, first of all, we're all now, we're trapped at home. We can't take a walk into the park just to decompress. You can't do, there's so many things that you can't do. There's so many ways in which you cannot interact or ask for help. And because of the uncertainty and because of the increased anxiety, all our emotions are volatile. Isolation for patient as well as the family. So the healthcare provider has to function as a bridge. And that can be a very, very difficult space for even the healthcare provider to be in. Because not only am I dealing with the care of the person, the treatment of the person, I am also suddenly asked to be the bridge to process this information, pass it along. And then what about, how that experience is like for me? And I may not have the time to adequately sit and empathize with that person and give them the information they need in an empathetic way. So all of these different things also complicate the experience of grief in COVID. And as we know, all our PPs hinder empathetic communication as well. So so the recipient of the bad news or the patient themselves are unable to make any human contact, and that makes a big difference. And this is something that I've already mentioned: inability to participate in traditional rituals and funerals. So there is a lack of closure that almost everybody is going through right now. So when you're communicating with families, these are a few tips to remember. Just remember that uncertainty leads to anxiety, which leads to imagining the worst. So in the absence of information, and this is something a lot of us are facing right now, that because the healthcare system is completely overrun, we're not getting adequate information. And it's not the fault of the healthcare provider either, because they're really stretched to the maximum limit. But then when you're not given adequate information, you just imagine the worst. So they might have actually been able to bring some of the symptoms under control. They might have actually been able to improve saturation, but I don't know about it. So I haven't heard from this person in 2 days. I don't know what the status is of this person. So I'm thinking, my God, like I think maybe he's on a ventilator right now. So there are those kind of things. So if you can have somebody on, so this is something that happened in New York at the Presbyterian Hospital at the height of the American wave last year, is that they brought in palliative care teams into the emergency units, where the doctors and nurses did what they had to do, but it was the palliative care professionals who were already trained in communicating bad news and having empathetic conversations, and didn't have to do all of the stuff that the emergency doctors were doing. They took on that role, and it had tremendous success, because not only did it ease the burden on the healthcare provider, allowing them to focus on their job, but it also was a chance for a more, informative and empathetic interaction between the healthcare system as well as the families. We use available technology to stay in touch with families at this point. And while this is a privilege many of us have, large parts of rural India don't have this privilege if they make it into a hospital at all. So giving clear information and avoiding jargon is very important. But also I would emphasize here, steering clear of misinformation and being very, very sure of the information that you're giving. Today, there is such a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. And, WhatsApp University is working at full throttle. So the information that we share has to be vetted as much as possible. Even now, the experts will tell you that building evidence is still happening. And, ventilators, remdesivir, this, that, whatever, like there's so much speculation that, at the best of times, the medical experts, the scientific experts are still keeping up with the new learnings. So for lay people, it's a whole other thing, right? So if you are in a position where you are bridging that gap in some way or helping a family navigate a system, please ensure that the information you give is not just clear, it is also vetted, and also avoid jargon. Please talk to more than one family member, because you do not know the emotional state of the person you're talking to. And sometimes a huge barrier to communication and receiving communication, absorbing it, is you as a communicator might avoid the jargon, you might give clear information. But if I'm emotionally all over the place, I may not absorb what you've said. So at this point, what's very important is that you talk to more than one family member if you can, to make sure that that information has been shared and probably absorbed better. If good symptom control is achieved, it must be shared. So like I said earlier, if some improvement has been made in the patient, it's very important to communicate that, even the small wins, because that really helps. So not just communicating when the news is bad or the person is deteriorating, but also to communicate when the person is improving. And that's a very important communication skill needed at the moment. And please do not take emotional responses personally. Everybody is really stretched at this point, and everybody is dealing with their own emotions. Everybody is dealing with their responses to what can only be called a humanitarian crisis on an epic scale. So don't take emotional responses personally. Be, empathetic to the reality that everybody is struggling, including yourself. So be prepared for guilt. Like I said, survivor guilt is a big one. To this person, and so try as much as possible to mitigate that, because that is a big one. And I mean, I've experienced where recently we've been part of a cluster that was completely infected, and the one person who brought it here supposedly really got, so many people were like, why did this person travel, why did they go there, why didn't they do the RT-PCR and all of that. But at the end of the day, nobody wants to be the vector. Nobody wants to be the one who gives it to somebody else. And it's really important for us to be compassionate towards that. It might be very difficult, especially if the fallout is very serious, but that's something for us to just be mindful of. And here's something. In this deluge of tragedy that is unfolding around us as healthcare workers, take a moment to ask the family to describe the patient as a person to you. Tell me about your dad, or tell me about your sister. Take a minute to ask them to describe this person to you in their own words. It is a very, very therapeutic tool when we are so strapped for time and in the middle of all this crisis, because that gives them the message that you see their loved one as a human being as well. And that's one of the things that we are really struggling with right now. Everybody's a statistic. So humanize the person for yourself, as well as to reassure the person that you're talking to that who they love is a person to you as well, and you'd like to know something about them. So offer to pass on messages to the patient. This is for people who work in hospital settings. And if family members struggle with what to say, suggest the following prompt. Most people in this situation say something along the lines of, thank you, I love you, please forgive me, or I forgive you. Literally, everybody wants to say something along these lines. So if somebody's struggling to find, I don't know what to say to this person, start here. This is a very simple prompt, and it actually, prompts them to say what they have to say, and it's also very healing for them. Okay, I'm going to very, very quickly now go into a section about children, because children are invisible patients all the time. We think that children don't express or experience grief as adults do. So I'm very quickly going to just touch upon this side of things. Most of the times, the myths around children, and I'm sure our friends who work in pediatric palliative care will also identify with this. A lot of the times, families and loved ones think that, oh no, they're too young to understand. They're not going to understand it. We have to protect children from loss and pain. They don't feel grief as adults do, and a lot of the times it's fears that we have. I may not say the right thing, but because we are afraid that we may not say the right, we deprive the child of the opportunity to have that interaction with somebody. I might upset them is something that we think. And we think that it's, when someone dies, we should just get rid of all the reminders. And that's actually really not a good thing to do, because what message it really gives them is that, them thinking or talking about that person is not a good thing. And that, by doing that, they're doing something wrong. Now, please remember, children's idea of right and wrong is very, very binary. They do not have abstract thinking, especially the very young children. So this subconsciously gives them the message that remembering that person overtly is not a good thing for them to do. And if a child is not expressing grief in a traditional way, we assume that they're not grieving. Arey, bachcha hai, isko kuch samajh mein nahi aa raha, wo to bahar jaake khelega. But pay attention to their behavior, and you'll find that they may not be expressing it or crying, but something in their activity is changing, something in their behavior towards their peers is changing. So be mindful of those things. And so the reality, the myths I've just talked about, the reality is that children understand much more than adults realize. And all children experience loss. They need to learn how to cope. So to protect them is actually doing them a disservice. If a child experiences a loss and you don't acknowledge the loss to the child and help them cope with it, what you're really doing is setting them on a path where they don't develop the skills to cope with loss in the future. Or by not acknowledging their loss, you are not honoring their personhood. This loss meant something to them. So to sit with them, not to assume and say, oh my God, okay, so this child's mother has died, so this child must be, no. It means let the child set the agenda and tell you what it means to them, or what their fears are around it and so on, and then bolster their coping skills accordingly. And they may not express it, or they may not express it as adults do, but they do feel it in their own way. And when your fears around you saying the wrong thing, just remember that there are no correct answers, only honest ones. But honesty without tact is just cruelty. So that's a very, very, very fine line. How you're going to do it, that's a whole other module. But honest ones. Is my mother dead? Yes, she's not. Well, yes, she's gone. Okay, so what does that mean? So it's a very difficult conversation, a conversation that most of us are not comfortable with. But to shy away from that conversation is even worse. Yeah, so if you feel ill-equipped to do it, get some help. There's enough and more literature out there to educate us on how some of these conversations can be had. Now, if you think that you're going to upset them, they're already upset. And that emotion needs to be recognized. I cannot be an ostrich and pretend that, oh, if I talk about this person's loss, it's going to upset them. I mean, which one of us, when we lose someone, forget about it the next minute? We don't. So it's not like, when a big loss is experienced, people forget about it the following week. And by talking about that person or that loss, you're reminding them. It's not that. You're actually acknowledging and commiserating that, yes, this meant something to you, and I acknowledge it and I respect it, and is there any way in which I can support you? Yeah. So to acknowledge loss is very, very, very important. And like I said, if you try to get rid of reminders, then this only tells the child that it is wrong to think of the deceased person. And that can cause a lot of maladaptive behavior later. So while children may not know how to express their grief, they also might be delaying it to avoid upsetting others. Okay, I can see that my mother's really upset that something has happened, so I don't want to upset her, so I'll just, I won't say anything. And a lot of children are then forced to grow up or to curb their own experience and expression. And by not expressing it, it's not going away, it's getting stuck somewhere else, which will eventually come out. You have to know that it will manifest in other ways. So it's very important to not assume that just because a child is not expressing it, they're not feeling it. And very quickly, children go through a series of stages around understanding death. This is where developmental stages become very important, and we need to educate ourselves in what those developmental stages implications are on the child's understanding of death and dying. Like I said, understanding these stages helps not only to guide the content, but also the timing of our communication. A 4-year-old experiences grief and death and dying, the concepts, very differently from an 8-year-old, very differently from a 12-year-old, very differently from a 15-year-old. And it all has to do with there's an interplay of not just their cognitive abilities, but also their biological development, their neurological development. And also it's complemented by the way adults around them behave and what adults model for them. So this is very important. And what children really need when they're grieving is information. They need to know what happened. And this has to be given sensitively. Children, please remember, are very, very, very active imaginations. And any gap in information, even more than adults, children's imaginations just take over. And their imagination can be very different from reality. So you have to give them information, appropriate information, development stage, appropriate information. You have to reassure them. Children need reassurance. They need reassurance that they're not alone. They need reassurance that safe adults are still around them. They need to be reassured that some things will stay normal. So there's a whole other discussion on that, where a child might ask you landscape questions like, okay, so who's going to take me to school now? And it comes across as a very selfish question, but actually really the child is trying to figure out, is anything going to stay normal in my life? So that kind of reassurance is necessary. And children need to express their feelings. Some children and sometimes that's how their volatile emotions are experienced. Manisha, I just got a message saying that my connection is unstable. I just want to check with you if I'm
Yes,
clear.
ma'am. Your voice just broke for a few seconds.
But is it okay now?
Not if it was our connection problem, but then it's okay now. It's
No.
okay.
All right, fine. Okay. So these are if there were 3 thumb rules that I'd like to share with you, is this: children need information, they need reassurance, and they need to be able to express their feelings. So please facilitate that, especially at a time of, extensive grief across the world. Very quickly, I want to make a distinction between grief and depression. They have a lot of common characteristics, and very often we mislabel grief as depression. And that is a big problem, because depression is a clinical pathological state.
Smriti, ma'am, we've lost you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's audible, but then it's breaking. Voice is breaking.
Should I try switching
Yes,
connections?
yes, ma'am. I think that'll be a good idea.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and I'll come back.
Okay.
Sorry about this.
Smriti, ma'am, or else if the video is cut down.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes, ma'am, it's better now.
Okay, so just Manisha, just step in and let me when it breaks up again, and then I'll switch. Okay, 1 second. Let me just come back.
Okay.
I mean, that's something that we should avoid doing, because depression is a clinical condition and it requires a different have common characteristics like intense sadness, fatigue, sleep and appetite disturbances, low energy, loss of pleasure, difficulty concentrating, overwhelming emotions interfering with ability to cope with everyday stressors. Now, these are just some of the commonalities between grief and depression. But when we mislabel grief as depression, then we fail to recognize that depression actually is a clinical condition that requires certain specific interventions, whereas grief is a normal response to loss. Okay. Now, grief, how do you make the distinction? Grief usually, while people are grieving, they usually stay connected to others. They might periodically experience pleasure and they continue their functioning. They are able to function. Whereas in depression, there is a loss of connection with others, an inability to feel, to experience even brief periods of pleasure. Okay, so that is one of the markers to distinguish between the two. But of course, when things get when people go into complicated grief, this distinction might be very, very difficult. And then complicated grief can very well have components of depression as well. So a fine line, but important for us to remember. Healthcare workers, I just want to specifically talk about healthcare workers for a minute. Right now are going through incredible vicarious suffering, are experiencing a lot of disenfranchised grief. I mean, as a healthcare worker, we are trained to, handle it case by case. Yes, get involved to a certain extent and stuff, but with the kind of mortality rate we're seeing outside today, it is impossible for a healthcare worker not to experience grief. Okay, grief over their own relationships, that they're not being able to be there for their own families while being out on the front lines. And, they might lose family members themselves, but they're supposed to come back to work. And we know enough and more doctors out there who are functioning when they should have been given, when under normal circumstances, they would have had some time to grieve over the loss of their own loved one. But instead, they're back out there trying to save the lives of other people. And they are also incurring multiple losses. There are role conflicts that they're experiencing. I'm a nurse, but I'm also a mother. Am I jeopardizing my family by being out in the front lines? Am I taking this back to my family? Sorry, Manisha, are you still there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Okay, so sorry, I just lost the side. Okay, and also things like, am I doing what I feel is morally right? There's a lot of moral conflict also that is happening amongst healthcare workers right now. And of course, guilt at not being able to save everybody, guilt at not being able to do their best, guilt at having to work with very limited resources and therefore not being able to, take care of people. And as of a few days ago, we know that now finally our MBBS students are asked to go to the front line and stuff. I mean, things that would have taken years for them to prepare for. They're now being thrown right into the heart of a brutal scenario. Now, someone so young who normally would have worked up through the ranks over many years with a lot of handholding, with a lot of mentoring, is now expected to go out and just deal with what can only be called carnage out there. Okay, so very quickly, we're going to also talk about bereavement, the event. So grief is the experience around loss, is a response to loss, but the actual event of the loss, the death of the person, or the ending of a relationship, or you can be bereaved even by the loss of a home, right? So the actual event is what bereavement is, and what follows after that is in the domain of bereavement, and it requires specific other interventions. In the pandemic, of course, so I've been so consumed by the whole pandemic issue that we haven't talked about what under normal circumstances, bereavement should look like. Bereavement support systems, bereavement counseling systems, all of those things. Now, typically, one of the ways of practicing bereavement support is that in the immediate aftermath of the loss, you help with practical things. Okay, who do I need to call for you? Can I help you fill out some forms? Those kind of ways in which you can support. A few days later, perhaps a week later, checking in with them, maybe after the funeral is over and so on. And then one more check-in, maybe 3 weeks later, because once the crowd goes away, or once the immediate, problems are resolved, that's when the person is really alone with their grief. So checking in with them 3 weeks later. So that usual system of on the next day or the same day or the next day, helping with practical, critical decision making, checking in with them a week later to see how they're doing, and maybe checking in 3 weeks later after the initial, activity has diminished. Now, in the pandemic, obviously bereavement is more complicated because of the changes to traditional societal mourning processes, and also because funerals, burials, and gatherings are governed by strict guidelines. I would say that this is further complicated. This slide is a little dated. When I say dated, I mean it's like 6 months old. But now what we're seeing is also all the issues around just our burials and cremations and all of those things, which I'm not going to get into in much detail right now. So in the pandemic, here are some tips for all of you. You can facilitate the expression of grief. And how do you do this? Encourage ventilation, maintain psychological presence. Psychological presence means that also to be okay with silence. Okay, and don't interrupt them. Be prepared for different emotions, not just sadness, but also anger, anxiety, stress, confusion, numbness, absolute silence. Be prepared for different emotions. Sorry, this slide is repeated, but it's supposed to be something else. And understand the context before giving interventions. Please understand who they've lost, what it means for them to be in that position right now, what are their concerns, who is with them, all of those things before we actually go into giving interventions. And also understand that the expression of anger towards doctors or treatment teams is a manifestation of acute emotional turmoil. So at that point, if somebody is accusing you, accusing your team, shouting about the healthcare system, all of that, don't think that it is necessary for you at that point to defend or to explain, because you just need to let them say what they're saying and just continue to just listen. Okay, if I try and start defending the healthcare system and saying, oh, but you know how stretched the healthcare workers are, or do you know what about the fact that the doctor had 15 patients to look after in that half an hour time, all of those things will not actually facilitate expression of grief. It might aggravate the situation. Facilitate the acceptance of death. Now, this is for visiting family members. This is something I forgot to mention, that visiting family members who are physically present in the same place where the patient who has died is, if possible, facilitate the viewing of the body under safety guidelines. I know this is very, very difficult at the moment, but if you're part of a system that can navigate this for them, that can go some way towards closure. Try and identify a family member who's tech savvy, so that you can hold a telefuneral or a memorial. And it may not be necessarily that same spouse or son or whoever, but try and identify not just a family member, but somebody who can assist them with this. And identify a friend or a family member who's capable of providing support through the process in the coming days. Somebody who is maybe a little bit emotionally removed from the situation and is able to make some decisions and so on. If you work in a hospital setting, assist in completing formalities like filling in forms or other details to obtain death certificates and so on, because that is something that in that moment in time, it is so difficult for a person to do. And by assisting them with very practical tasks like this, you will actually be helping them a lot. For non-visiting family members who are away in different cities or different countries, empathetic communication, of course, is very important. I'm not going to get into the elements of that because you've already gone through classes on it. Allow expression of any kind without interruption. So that's similar to what you do with a visiting family member. Normalize expressed emotions. It is perfectly normal for you to be feeling like this right now. Okay, I mean, that's something that we want to make them feel, that what they're feeling right now is not abnormal. Assist with critical decision making. What are critical decisions? Okay, who is with you? Do you have transport? How are you going to, what are some of the forms that I need to help you with? All of those kinds of things. Is there anybody you need to call? Is there any family member that you need to also be speaking to right now? Those kind of things. Please respect individual decisions. Not everybody is going to respond positively. Not everybody is going to want to take up the advice that you give them. And that is absolutely fine, because people are coping with a tremendous barrage of information and a lot of different emotions at that point. And emphasize the importance of mourning, and that it will take time. That what you're experiencing right now is awful, and you're probably going to feel, this way for some time. It is natural for you to feel bad about it. It will probably take a few more weeks before you can come to terms with what has happened. It will take longer to even accept what has happened. Okay, encourage identification of social connections and facilitate those calls for them. So I'm taking you through the sequence in a timeline. Okay, so not all of this needs to be done at once. Once they've had a chance to ventilate their feelings and so on, that's when they'll have some sort of clarity of thought to be able to identify social connections. Yes, my neighbor in my building is a very nice person, and I think, yeah, she'll probably be able to help me, at least with some food and stuff like that. I don't know. So facilitate that call. Yeah, I probably need to talk to my brother about this. Okay, can I put you on a call with him? When would you like to do it? Would you like me to schedule that? Connect them to teleconsultations for mental health support. I mean, we run the Sukh helpline, of course, but not everybody is culturally prepared to call, a helpline. Usually we look to our friends and family for support. We don't have that culture in India of picking up a phone and dialing a helpline. But at a time when your own family is also going through that tremendous amount of grief, and even our friends and neighbors are going through their own losses, that option may not be available to them. So to encourage them to call helplines that have credible counselors is something that you can encourage, but not just encourage and say, hey, there are so many helplines, why don't you call one of them? Actually give them a few numbers that you have vetted. Don't give them one more task to do where they have to search for a helpline themselves. Okay. And finally, emphasize that they're not alone. Very hard to convince somebody at this point that they're not alone, but that's what we do. Now, finally, while dealing with a grieving person, please remember that your behavior is more important than your words. Be aware of your own feelings. If you are emotionally volatile, it may not be the best time for you to provide support to somebody, because you could very well be projecting your own feelings. So be very aware of your own feelings. If you are, you yourself are burnt out, then perhaps maybe that's not the time for you to provide support. Look after yourself, come back when you're stronger. Be patient. Don't be in a hurry to give information and advice, just listen. Bearing witness to somebody's grief is the greatest service you can do them. Don't overprotect people or hurry them through any process. Okay, what you need to do next is call a helpline. No, don't. We're not ready. Let it be. If they're not ready to do something, don't push them to do it. Oh no, if you do this, you'll feel better. No, if they say no, respect that. Help people find their own solutions to problems. Don't tell them your solutions. If I was in your position, I would do this. You're not in their position. Okay. And at an appropriate moment, share a happy or moving experience that you shared with, or a memory that you have with the person who has passed away. This is a really beautiful thing you can do. People want to know stories, happy stories about people they loved. And if you say, hey, I remember a time when your dad did this for me, and he told me this joke, or your dad did this for me, or your mother did this for me. Someone very recently told me 20 years after my mother died that she would knit him a sweater every Christmas. And I cannot tell you what a lovely thing that was for me to hear, because it gave me insight into the kind of person she was. And finally, don't tell them what they should or shouldn't be feeling or saying. Please don't compare their grief to experiences of others or you. Yeah, it's really sad that you lost your 98-year-old grandmother, but at least she lived a good life. I mean, look at that other poor woman who's lost her 16-year-old son. Please don't do that. Please don't compare stories. Be clear about what you can offer and make sure that you follow through. If you're going to do something for them, do it. And never promise something that you don't think you have the bandwidth to do. Be aware of that cultural differences will influence how people grieve and how they will receive your suggestions, and they will receive you as a person. And don't take that seriously. Don't personally, not seriously. Don't take it personally. And learn to recognize that grieving difficulties, like complicated grief, disenfranchised grief, all of those things exist. And if you feel that they are not coping and they need help, please refer to professional help from counselors and therapists. This is a quote that I remember coming across many years ago, which says, grief, I've learned, is just really love. And it's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All of that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. And grief is just love with no place to go. So with that, I'm going to stop. We have 10 minutes for interactions, and I really hope my connection holds. Please feel free to turn on your videos. Easier for me to communicate with you there. And I think it's a small enough group for us to have the bandwidth to have videos on. Okay. So much better to see everyone.
Ma'am, I think there were a few comments in the chat box. If you could just go through them.
I have been in and out of connection, so I don't know if I have all this. Yeah, let me just check. Okay.
A great session actually today, Smriti. Thank you so much, especially with the times that are going on. I think you've really touched so many of our lives today, seriously telling you, because I just went through grief yesterday and day before. And thank you so much for this for today. Really, it means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I'm sorry that you're experiencing so much grief. And I was wondering about the appropriateness of this session today, but I'm glad you found it useful. Grief can cause depression. You're absolutely right, Vandana. In fact, it can spiral into that. My concern sometimes is that, we use the word depression so loosely. And that's something all of us in mental health, I think we know, I mean, there's a need to use language appropriately. And, like a medical professional will never tolerate a condition or a disease being mislabeled, because that means very serious consequences. But somehow that boundary is a little less firm when it comes to mental health. And I think in order to truly respect somebody and to truly respect their experience, we need to not rush in to label them. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to make that distinction. Earlier, it was believed that you don't diagnose somebody with depression for 2 months after they have suffered a bereavement. That was earlier the standard practice. Now that paradigm is changing. I mean, so if you look at the new ICD categorization and stuff, it is now being recognized that grief and depression can coexist. And after a certain period of time, if certain sort of maladaptive behaviors continue to persist, then we should certainly be assessing for depression and making sure that the person is getting appropriate interventions and support for depression, and not just assuming that they're depressed. I feel like we're going to have a big problem on our hands in the coming months with this.
Yeah, thank you for that, Smriti. What I also wanted to say was there are a lot of people who do not address their grief, and they keep it inside, and then ultimately, if there's no outlet for the grief that they have, it manifests in different ways. So yes, thank you for clarifying that. And also something that I wanted to share with the group, I read something very beautiful about grief, and I came across this article where it said grief is like a candle, a beautiful candle that stays in front of you. If you don't burn the candle, it'll not go away. So until unless you address the grief, it'll keep bothering you in some way or the other. I just wanted to share that. I thought that was beautiful, a very beautiful comparison. But till you burn the candle, till the wax starts melting and goes away, grief is something similar. You need to face it, and you don't have to push it under a carpet.
Yeah, we need to permit one another to express. One is to permit one another and to share in it, and to not then impose ourselves in any sort of how do I put this? To refrain from projecting our emotions also, and like I said in the last couple of slides, it's very important to witness the person for who they are and what they are experiencing and what this experience means to them. And not to draw comparisons with similar experiences we might have had, because no two experiences are the same for two people. And so I'm just reading that comment in the chat box about the 3-year-old telling Stella that once a person dies means they cannot play anymore. How sweet is, for that's it for a child, that's how they understand when someone is gone and they can't play. And if you look at the literature around, how children express and talk about grief, there are some stunningly profound metaphors that children have used, and things that you and I would be very, very surprised that a child is capable of expressing in that way, and sometimes they do it better than we do. So yeah, I'm just trying to wean out if there are any specific questions that people have. Please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Smriti ma'am. The things that you told, few of the things I was very much able to relate it to the experiences I am having in the COVID ward with few of the patients. So a very small experience that I would like to cite is it was happening that in the past week the ICU and the HDU that we tell, where the less severe patients are kept. So when there was a death in the past few days in the ICU, the HDU patients used to see those patients going out or moving out of that particular place. And once that patient was shifted, the bed used to be empty. So the HDU patient itself, the beds used to be rotated. So there was this particular grief that the nursing officers, they reported that often we try to motivate these patients, but they get so much demotivated, even though we tell them, try to show them that see your SpO2 level is increasing, but still we see that they are very much demotivated seeing that particular scenario. So what can we do at that point of time? So this was the scenario that was happening. I was just trying to connect with, yes, they are the invisible patients and which we do not address, since they are the ICU bedbound patients with the oxygen. They cannot speak to us with the counselors or others. The nursing officers are there, but still what can we do for them at that point of time? So what I tried to do, I don't know whether I did it correctly or not. I decided that at one particular point of the time, we will try to play some soothing music as a part of some positive music, or it can be old songs which they can try to connect to, because in the hospital you can hear the beep of the oxygen cylinder. So it's obviously very much depressing. So that is how I try to address it. And I was also trying if we can put some this one videos of success story, but then we thought no, the patients might not even like it. So if other than that also on my part, if I can do something, so that would be very much great to know from your side, from your experience, ma'am.
Thank you, Sandamita. I mean, I think that, that element of introducing music, and yeah, I mean, one of the most horrible sounds is just the constant, machines and monitors. And I wonder, and you were very right and very wise in deciding that maybe the success stories videos are not what they need to see, because what happens to those who are not following that trajectory? So then there is a tendency for us to, I've said this before, that there is a battle rhetoric, where if somebody is not improving at a particular way or something, feel like I'm failing. I'm like, even this, I'm not getting better. What am I, like, how is this going to end? So it can actually aggravate the anxiety. So it's very wise that you recognize that. And I think the fact that you're looking at it the way you're looking at it itself is tremendous. What I would imagine is try and understand from the nurses, because they're the only ones who have access to the ICU, patients. What are some of their difficulties? What are some of the questions, or what are some of the things they find hard to address in a communication way? And perhaps, because not everybody has the training or, the ability in that moment to draw them to come up to answer the right response. And sometimes when we're unable to give the right response, we come away feeling worse about ourselves. Or, God, I shouldn't have said that. Or sometimes some people, because they don't know what to say, become abrupt. And then that affects the relationship, with the patient also. I mean, sometimes, very often I hear, my husband was in the hospital recently, and, at one point he said, the nurse was so abrupt. And I said, the nurse has 40 people in that ward looking to look after, so of course she's going to be abrupt, but she's giving you your medication on time and stuff like that. But I almost feel guilty, because both sides need empathy at that point. Huh?
Yes.
Now, but how do we empower the nurses to be able to, okay, what questions were asked of you that you found difficult to answer? And so, okay, let me equip you with some of the things that you might be able to appropriately say in that situation, or to guide. So I'm saying that maybe we may not be able to do everything we can for the patients in our care, but certainly we can, at this point especially, bolster the capacity of the healthcare workers, so that they feel like at least they're not so helpless. In the early part of the pandemic last year, the horror stories that we heard from healthcare workers coming in from Italy and stuff was primarily that the trauma they experienced because they didn't have the vocabulary to address some of the things that they were faced with. But we in palliative care, or we as counselors, we have some of that vocabulary. So if we can just equip, our colleagues, I think that might overall help the situation a little bit. So I mean, I'm just saying it's very difficult. It's a very, very difficult situation to be in. But yeah.
Can I share something? So when I was admitted, Smriti spoke about having a palliative care team, visiting the patient or maybe interacting with the family members. I saw 2 deaths. And at that moment, I realized that they actually went without anyone around them. If there was a palliative team around, somebody would have held their hand, somebody would have spoken to them, or maybe connected them to their family via a video call. So I think if provisions are made to include a palliative team in some way, but then, just a thought, how feasible is that? I don't know, because COVID is so contagious. To get somebody into the ward is again a huge challenge. So I read an article recently where a doctor wrote about arranging for tele-palliative consults. So, that also sounded a very practical way. I don't know where it was, some hospital in the US, and they've started doing that. And it's helping not only the families, but also some patients deal with just the isolation and the disease, the side effects of the disease, or maybe when the patient is on a ventilator. So just some sort of communication with the patient.
So I guess, yeah, sorry, please go on, Sangeeta.
Yes, Vandana ma'am, as you said, I don't know, actually, I would like to ask the question that, is it feasible or is it effective to have telecounseling with the ICU or bedbound patients? Because the other positive patients I am doing, but I am not quite sure with the ICU patients.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult also because a person is sometimes, I mean, most of the time they're not in any position to even, have a conversation. If you ever went, if you're intubated and things like that, it's a lot of the times the patients are sedated and things. I would also think about, okay, where the palliative care team came into the Presbyterian hospital setting was to actually be the outward facing team dealing with the families in terms of communication and stuff. So because these are trained healthcare workers who are able to quickly pick up bits of information, rather than having the attending team have to deal with that. Like I know a lot of hospitals now have a communications team. How equipped are the communication teams to have that conversation? I don't know. Because as we all know, communication in the way that it is taught in palliative care is very different from how it's taught in different settings. So at a point where there's intense grief, intense anxiety, there is a possible death looming. I don't know how many people have been trained to have those kinds of conversations. And it takes, I would imagine it takes a fair degree of practice for us to be able to have those conversations. And I recently spoke with the team at the hospital that some of the people in my family were admitted, and they were burnt out because that's all they're doing all day. Now, this is a person who one of them was a doctor, but she's never been trained in having this conversation. She knows how to give clinical information. She's trying to give positive information that, okay, your so-and-so's, saturation level is up now to 87, which is a really, it's an improvement from 68. So, she's saying that, but what does it mean to the family? I mean, to break that down, to de-jargonize it, to figure out the concerns that they might have. So those kind of outward facing conversations, the healthcare system outwards to the family, so that there is a bridge. I think that's where the palliative care, trained professionals can come in a little bit more effectively, I would imagine. And also, let's not forget that while lots and lots and lots of people are infected with COVID, there are all those people who don't have COVID but have other comorbidities, who have other very serious illnesses that they're still having to deal with, and they can't even make it to a hospital, or they're not getting access to the medicines they need. And that's where, reaching out to those families becomes very important as well, because COVID might have come, but the cancer hasn't gone away, the tuberculosis hasn't gone away, all of those diseases haven't gone away. This is just overlaid on top of all of that. So we are actually 7 minutes over time, and I want to just ask for any sort of
Thanks a ton, Smriti ma'am. Parul here, yeah.
Hi, Parul.
Yes, hello. As you rightly said, I feel all these Pallium India sessions which we have gone through, it's really difficult to translate into words. And hats off to all of you to have done this. You know, expressing the emotion in words is really the toughest task, I feel. Secondly, as you said, after the death of a dear one or a family member, close family friends play a very important role. Just their presence will definitely help the person who has lost the member from the family. And at the hospital, I feel during this time, if there are good paintings or little potted flower plants, you know, around, that also helps. It's a very soothing and passive. It's a very silent way of bringing some solace and comfort to the eyes of the patients also who are there. You know, words at that time, it's very difficult to talk, or some TV screen doesn't make any sense. But such things, very good paintings can definitely, you know, make a difference. As well as greenery with plants around. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Parul. Thank you so much. Manisha, I'm sorry. I've got my wires crossed. We have done a trauma-informed response session as well, right? With this group.
Yes, ma'am.
So some of the techniques that we use in trauma-informed response, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to, tell you guys about it. That can be very effective, because what we're facing right now is, I think apart from people who've been well trained in counseling skills and palliative care skills, the only other people who've really had the experience of this are people who've worked in war settings, and literally combat settings and things like that. Because if you were to draw a comparison to the kind of urgency and the kind of trauma and tragedy that is unfolding, it is a warlike situation. Now, in that sort of a situation, in a humanitarian crisis kind of situation, some of the things that we talk about are, interoception, how doing a body scan, just sort of, and this is more for you healthcare workers than anybody else, or for your nurses who work in the ICU, Sangeeta, because with all this, everything that they have to deal with, just doing a quick, 3-4 minute body scan, just sort of mentally scanning your body internally, it actually is a very centering thing. The other thing is to, Parul just mentioned, why I remember this is because you have one normal thing in your environment. Amongst all the ICUs and things like that, something that is normal and untouched by all this disease and death around you could be a potted plant. It could be, looking out the window and seeing a tree or something, focusing your attention on something that is actually not part of this entire crisis situation around you and has some sense of being constant. That's one thing. So in fact, if you go back to the humanitarian crisis modules that we had done earlier in this series, in that PowerPoint about some of the centering techniques that can be used, it was in the context of healthcare workers, but you can also use it in the context of family members and, possibly patients who are not in the ICU, but people who are in the general wards. And I know for a fact that you might be improving, your saturation is getting better, but when you look around you, as there are 39 other people around you in varying states of distress, then holding on to that, your own sense of calm becomes very challenging for a few people, especially because you don't have your family members around and stuff like that. I mean, in the hospital that my husband was at, the guy next to him just didn't want to sleep on the bed. He wanted to sleep on the floor, and he kept insisting on it because that was where he felt most comfortable. And the nurses were like, you can't be on the floor, you have to be on the bed. But that guy, every time the nurse left, he would just crawl back under his bed to sleep. And so, my husband was thinking, what do I tell him? Should I tell the nurse that he does this every time? So this is how your world becomes like that for those few days. So helping them with those trauma-informed response techniques also, these are very simple techniques. They are designed to be simple, to be used in a highly volatile crisis situation. So please look it up. And I'm also happy to re-share that with you through Manisha as part of the learning materials as well. So I think we've well overshot time. Thank you all very much. I'll stop here for now. And
Thank you
you're
so
very
much,
welcome to write. Yeah. Thank you so much. Look after yourselves, everyone, and be safe.
Thanks a lot, Smriti ma'am. Thank you, everyone. So we'll meet next week with another session, and that'll be our last session for this season. So see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you, Smriti ma'am and team. Take care, all of you. Be safe.